the jury could not convict. It was a mistrial, which tends to show you, I guess, how difficult it is to try these cases in court against police officers. The federal government in that case stepped in and filed a criminal indictment against Officer Slaker. And he actually pled guilty to violating Mr. Scott's civil rights. So the question on appeal was not his guilt, but his sentence, and whether or not he should be sentenced under a cross-reference for murder, which is what the government alleged, versus a cross-reference for voluntary manslaughter, which is what he claimed had actually happened. The district court judge found it appropriate to sentence him for a cross-reference for murder and sentence him to 20 years in prison. And that case came up on appeal to our court, and we affirmed that sentence. Those cases are difficult, and prosecutors in this room can talk about that because jurors tend to want to believe, even today's environment, tend to want to believe officers' view of things. But they can be pursued. They can be prosecuted under the proper circumstances.
And so for our young people who are listening to the lawyers talk and the judge talk about the system, how it works, do you feel like it is working for you, in your favor, on your behalf?
I think it is for me. Personally, I have only had positive experiences with law enforcement. I think it might be part of where I live in Waxhaw, but for the most part, I think what they're doing has shown great improvement, and my experiences have been good. I know, like, my siblings, I have brothers who have had stops and, like, run-ups with the law, but, like, my brother, when he was pulled over, they called backup on him, like, 4 cops. But I personally haven't had any negative experiences with law enforcement.
Sean, how about you?
That's a very tough question. And on the purpose just by saying that, me, myself, I'm just very good at code switching, you know, and I think that's very important within the African American community, is being able to go around different groups of people and to remain true to yourself, but at the same time be mindful of how other groups of people interact. But many of the people I associate with, some of my friends, they're not all good at code switching, right? So we have this African American dialect, then you have like American Standard English, you know. Right now I'm speaking in American Standard English. But if I'm just chilling with my friends, it's not always as proper, right? And I say that to say this, is I, as well as like the giants, the shoulders that I stand on, have put me in a really good position to succeed. So fortunately, outside of like the speeding ticket, I haven't had any interactions with the system. A lot of that is just being mindful of the society that I live in, knowing that, you know, anything that I do is going to be critiqued, right? You know, if I show up late to work, is that am I being viewed as just being late, or am I viewed as being late because I'm black, type of thing? Those are things I have to be mindful of. My language when I speak to people, and just different things. So to answer your question, the system has its flaws. I mean, that's the truth. There's communication barriers in law enforcement, and there's communication barriers within the African American community, right? Because people can, you know, black people can protest, but when it's time to go on a jury trial, everybody got work, you know, there's so many reasons why they can't serve. Work, get your money, you know, because the court's not going to pay you much when you serve on a jury. That's the truth. But at the same time, if you can protest, you can sit on a jury to be in a courtroom, to listen to the facts, and to give your take on what actually happened. You know, it's easy to just get on YouTube or get on Twitter and have a perspective. It's harder to be in court for weeks on out and, you know, listen to the truth. And the same thing with law enforcement is that there's this whole blue wall of silence, right? So yes, there are good cops, but it's tough to see good cops if they're always silent when something happens. You know, I can understand the whole, you don't want to throw anybody under the bus, and that's with any organization, right? You know, if you work for a business, a bank, a law, you know, wherever, you want to make sure that you have your employees back because you still have to work with them. But at the same time, you have to be mindful that if you're silent, then it's making it seem like nobody in your organization, you know, really cares. So
We're going to come back to the protest element that you raised. Put a pin in that. Don't let me forget it. I want the defense attorneys, Mr. Hill and Mr. Ferguson, to talk about the diversity of juries. You've been in state court, federal court, you've been in North Carolina and other courts. What does the diversity look like on jury panels, and does it make a difference in these sorts of cases, racially charged cases?
Well, let me just talk about a case that's actually pending before the North Carolina Supreme Court right now. And that's a case under the Racial Justice Act. North Carolina in, I think around 2010, passed a law which said if race was a factor in any aspect of a criminal trial, then that trial should be set aside. And one of the factors was whether or not race was a factor in jury selection. Now, over the years, I have personally witnessed in case after case, in trial after trial, in criminal court, prosecutors excusing jurors for no reason other than they were black. And they wouldn't admit that. Then in 1987, the Supreme Court decided a case which says that it's called Batson, Kentucky, Batson versus Kentucky tonight. But the U.S. Supreme Court said that if a prosecutor excuses jurors because they were black, then a defendant could get relief for that. And what happened over the years is that instead of prosecutors being educated by that and finding ways not to discriminate, they spent a lot more time finding ways to discriminate and not get caught and have some explanation as to why they did it. So we did a study over a 20-year period in North Carolina from 1990 until 2010. When I say we, I don't mean I did it or Porter did it. But there was some researchers from the University of Michigan who studied juries in capital cases in North Carolina over a period of 20 years. And what they found as part of that study in this case that we're still litigating now is that for African American jurors in cases involving the death penalty, that for African Americans who were called for jury service, they were 4 times more likely to be excused from serving on the jury than white jurors of similar backgrounds and whatnot. So there was no question that race played a part in jury selection in capital cases in North Carolina over a period of time. And as a result of that, a judge who happened to be African American heard that challenge. I think it was around 2012 when we did that. And that judge found that race was a significant factor in jury selection in capital cases in North Carolina. And in the cases before the judge did what the law said the judge is supposed to do. The judge set aside the death penalty in those 4 cases that were before him at the time and imposed a sentence of life imprisonment as the law required. And that case is what's being litigated now in the North Carolina Supreme Court, and we'll see in the coming months where that goes. So there has been that attack, but I make the point simply that, and I think it would be true in any study, whether it's capital cases or not, but in practically any study you did of jury selection in criminal cases in North Carolina, you would find that prosecutors almost routinely over the years have excused jurors because of their race, but they would never admit that. I'll give you one quick little personal anecdote. Even before Batson, I was always challenging the prosecution's use of their peremptory challenge, where they could take a juror off for no reason, didn't have to explain. And in one case, I was trying here in Mecklenburg County. A Mecklenburg County judge who is now maybe trying cases up in the sky. But when I objected to the prosecution using its peremptory challenges to excuse African Americans from the jury, the judge stopped the trial and ordered me and the prosecutor into his judge's chambers. And no sooner than I got in the room, Mr. Ferguson, why are you always injecting race into a case? And I'm kind of caught off guard. I said, well, Judge, I didn't inject race into the case. I simply expressed what was going on, and I objected because the prosecution was using his peremptory challenges to excuse African American jurors who were no different from the white jurors other than the color of their skin. And I felt it was my duty to protect the record in that regard. So he growled and mumbled something and went back into the court, and I continued to do the same thing. But my point is that over the years, prosecutors have done that, and often lawyers are afraid to object. I mean, the last thing you want the judge to do is haul you into his chambers and chew you out. But what I recognize is that's part of the price you pay as a lawyer for protecting the rights of your client and really the rights of people to be treated equal in court. So it has happened. I think it still happens. It doesn't happen as blatantly nor as much. But part of what we dealt with in this case I'm telling you, the Racial Justice Act cases, was something that it's become fairly well known now. It's called implicit bias. That's where our whole experience when it comes to race, whatever our backgrounds are, we carry that with us where we go. And lawyers carry it into the courtroom. Prosecutors carry it into the courtroom. So that people sometimes discriminate. They don't even know they're discriminating. But they've grown up and experienced it so often and so regularly that it happens and they don't even know that they're discriminating against. So yes, I think race is still very much a factor, and not just in jury selection, but in other ways in the court system as well. And I don't have time to tell you all the ways it happens because we'd be here at midnight. But it still happens.
We have an audience question for Mr. Merriweather. Can you comment on the temperament of the detectives in the video who were questioning Starr? What are you doing within the system to have your colleagues respect the experiences of traumatized victims?
Yeah, it was terrible. And I guess I can use the mic for this one. So first, take officer-involved shooting out of it. Any witness or victim who would be cross-examined or interrogated in that way is awful. It gives any investigator hardly any chance at actually finding the truth. The questions were sort of kind of close-ended. It didn't allow her to offer her full account of exactly what happened. And that's a terrible way to seek information. So on its face, that was terrible. Now, moving to officer-involved shootings, one of the things that I've committed to do since I've been in office is I report to every single both scene of an officer-involved shooting in Mecklenburg County, as well as whenever there are interviews with critical witnesses. If it's the day of, I will be there. And if not me, it's the leader of the team in my office that reviews officer-involved shootings to review and sit in on any critical interviews of witnesses. Why that's significant is to make sure that when you see something like that happening, that everything stops. And if need be, to go in and tell whoever is investigating, be it the State Bureau of Investigation or a local police department, that they need to get right and make sure that they're treating this like they would any other case where there's been actually a victim of potential crime or potential victim of crime. That's one of the safeguards, and it's also one of the reasons why, as a prosecutor, it's important to maintain the independence of your role, that you are not an attorney for a particular law enforcement agency, but you are, again, an attorney who's assigned to do the work of the state, in this case the state representing the public and the community, and you cannot never lose sight of such independence.
All right, another audience question, Mr. Hill. If you mentioned that police misconduct is not, well, the criminal justice system is not the best place to handle police misconduct. How should it be handled?
Well, I think it's one of the appropriate places, but oftentimes police-involved shootings are not well served by murder prosecutions and criminal prosecutions, just because it's a very high standard. I mean, just as a defense lawyer, an ideal client would be a cop who started his shift with no animus towards anyone, gets caught up in a situation, fires his gun, and kills somebody. To find first-degree premeditated murder in that situation is very difficult. And I think the larger problem often is systemic. I think we've got to deal with the fact that officers have a highly militarized, hostile approach to communities. It's very, there's a fear factor when they come upon young black males that just isn't there. When they arrested Dylan Roof and the person who shot the folks in Mother Emanuel Church, it was like the cops came up on him, and it was like he was a Boy Scout when they treated him that way. I mean, if they were out looking for a young black male accused with that kind of shooting, there would be a very, very different approach. And so I think that's the piece that needs to be attached. It needs to be reformed. And I do think police-involved shootings is a very different beast. I mean, when a police officer is involved in a shooting, he's not like any other citizen. The other officers don't ask him questions. He's not interrogated. By contract, he usually has a right to counsel, and the Fraternal Order of Police provides the counsel for them. When you talk about that long blue line, that long blue line protects everyone on that squad. And so when folks get interrogated and when they get questioned, that's a matter of hours or days. And all sorts of mischief happens there. In the movie, where the most important thing with Star's interview is that her mother was there. And that her mother was a nurse, her dad had some experience with the criminal justice system, with the Panthers, had a consciousness and awareness. So she went into that room with all of that. Most of the witnesses, and particularly young kids that get caught up in that situation, don't have a parent present. Don't have two parents who have some sense of what happens in the interrogation room and can prepare the child for that kind of interrogation. So for me, the most important thing there was the mother was in there, and she was advocating for Star. And I think what we need to do as a community is advocate. I've had too many clients whose parents are members of churches like this. They get arrested, and mom or grandma just trots them down to the police station and just throw the child in. And the child is uneducated with respect to what his or her rights are, or what the motivations of the interrogators are. And if in fact law enforcement is entitled to their union representation and automatic counsel before they're interviewed, why shouldn't a juvenile? Why shouldn't a young person? Why shouldn't anyone have access to counsel before they're interrogated? The Supreme Court says that it's okay for police officers to lie to citizens in interrogation room to make stuff up. And they do it every day of the week. They lie and they make stuff up to shape hopefully not to shape the testimony, but to unloosen the wheels, to put fear. And in capital cases, what we see all too often is the person arrested is feeble-minded, often mentally impaired. So you put an officer in that situation who is free and licensed to lie and create facts during the interrogation and have no sanction. What comes out is unreliable information. That's why you have 168, exonerated people from death row. It's because, there can be confessions, but if the confessions are not, based on solid ground, solid evidence, it's distorted and inaccurate.
All right, we're going to be wrapping up soon, but I have a few more audience questions. Kelsey, as a youthful voice, what keeps you up at night as you think of police and the justice system?
My brother being next. That's what keeps me up at night. Or, okay, I won't get emotional. My father. Someone that I know as a black person, or a black person that I know that I'm close to ends up being next. That's what keeps me up at night. Or for myself being next. Just being pulled over is what worries me. And for there to be no justice about it. That's what worries me the most. Or just experiencing just pretty much hateful crime just because of what I look like. I've experienced it before and it's traumatized me for months. It happened at my school by a teacher who, not that I looked up to, but who I expected to be an advocate for me, who literally shot me down and told me, no, you don't know anything. And I'm like, yes, I do. I went to a school with a 98% graduation rate, graduated on time, so I know something to be able to graduate. So for me to be told that shot me down and it hurt me. Of course, he apologized. My parents were right there with me the whole process. But still, when I see stuff like this, it's like those worries ring in the back of my mind. And it's like, wow. Just because of what I look like, I really got to experience that? That sucks. So.
Judge Diaz, this wasn't directed to you, but I am. Can you define the term jury of your quote peers? Khalil's jury did not look like his peers.
Well, I think it gets back to what Mr. Ferguson was talking about with respect to the use of peremptory challenges. The Constitution requires that a jury, at least the larger veneer, be selected from a cross-section of the community. It's supposed to reflect the larger community. Of course, the 12 people that end up actually in the box is oftentimes a matter of strategy on the part of lawyers. Both the prosecution and defense are looking for juries or jurors who they think are amenable to their view of the case. Now, it's the judge's role, Mr. Ferguson talked about the judge, to try to make sure that both the jurors and, if not more important, equally important, that the defendant's rights are protected in that process. And so, at least here in Mecklenburg County, everybody gets a summons, whether they want to be there or not. Some people get summoned more often than others. It's often a function of voter rolls, driver license rolls, and sometimes some communities are underrepresented in those particular databases. So the goal is to have a jury of your peers, but as Mr. Ferguson pointed out, sometimes whether intentionally or not, who ends up being in that box doesn't entirely reflect the demographics of a particular defendant, and that is unfortunate, but that's the goal, is to have a cross representative of the people of the community to sit in judgment of that person. to make the call as to whether or not the prosecution has met its burden in a case. And that's important. I think when I was a Superior Court judge, I tried to instill in people who it was the last place they wanted to be. And you probably have this experience as well. They don't want to be there. But you all are the voice and conscience of the community. When you show up for that day, you are speaking for your community when you get in that jury box. It's important, I think, for all of us to take that responsibility seriously. Because only in that way can we really have a representative jury of one's peers.
And this will be our last question. When we were comprising the panel of professional panelists, we were really looking for perspectives, defense attorneys, prosecutors, judges. It turns out you are all men of color. Can you talk a bit about your tension in participating in this process that is so filled with men of color? Mr. Smith, you touched on it earlier.
Touched on what specifically?
Forgot that song. You were talking about your role in prosecuting men of color and bringing a certain perspective to police as they are working through their investigations.
I think it is important, as I said before, I'm a Charlotte native and I've been at the U.S. Attorney's Office for 25 years. So when things happen, I think as Judge Diaz noted, it is a thin line. I do have an interest, say for example, when crimes happen. Well, I have, relatives who live here, so I believe in protecting the community. But at the same time, there's a difference between even you have not only who you convict, but also in terms of sentencing. For example, definitely see too many young African-American men who are criminal defendants. And I have two sons who are teens, and I see through them, through the fact that this is a stat where pretty much the male brain is not fully mature until 25. So you have a lot of folks who are doing things that maybe when they're young, but particularly the federal system, that they may be in jail almost for the rest of their lives. So how do you bring, a challenge as a prosecutor is bringing your experiences, but also as a community and as a person, a little bit of mercy, a little bit of understanding and judgment to be fair to everybody. I think that's what it is. But I will also say, and I speak for Mr. Merriweather too, I think sometimes, there's no way to say it, as a black prosecutor, you can be maligned a little bit, but at the same time, I do feel an obligation to protect the community, and I think folks also have to consider there are cases that we don't take. There are times when we will say, stop our colleagues from, like I said before, exercising perhaps some of their implicit biases. So it's a tough job, but I think it's also important in terms of being where I am and doing what I do.
I've been a lawyer for 37 years now, and I spent 10 years in D.C. Lockout court, arraignment court, it was almost all black. Here in North Carolina, when I was with the firm, I'd go to all of the counties. And you go to Avery County, you go to Ashe County, you go out west where the population is 2% black, and 25-30% of the lockup would still be black in a county where it's 1% black. It's just remarkable. Part of what I'm focused on now is trying to undo some of the worst aspects of 30 years of mass incarceration, because that has weighed more on the African American community than any other part of our society. And when we look at some of the sentences that were handed out in the 90s, the 80s, the early 2000s, when you talk about genocide, it's very close to some form of legal genocide, where we know drug use among the racial populations is about even. The same percentage of people across the board use drugs. When you look at where drug enforcement is focused and where punishments and sentencings are focused, it's completely out of whack. And it's been that way since the launch of the war on drugs in the early 80s. And so part of what I'm trying to do now is to bring some focus on how do we correct that, both in the going forward, but also there are people locked up, doing 20, 30, 40, 50 years for stuff that any rational person would say, you know, a 5-year sentence, a 10-year sentence is appropriate. The American Law Institute, which is the most highly thought of legal community in the country, the ALI, has recommended a second look on criminal sentencing whenever a person's been sentenced for 15 years. Just so that people can take a look now and say, does the sentence make sense now? And we've moved away from the news that bleeds in the evening news and the tabloid treatment of crime. 15 years later, does this sentence make sense? Or should we take a second look and do it over again? I think that's a conversation as a community we need to have. And I think stakeholders, law enforcement, prosecutors, need to be engaged in that conversation.
To be frank, I don't have a lot of tension about serving in this role at being who I am. And part of that's because I feel like I know who I am and why I'm here. My first interaction with a police officer, person to person, was a violent one. I take that experience with me into the work that I do. I also recognize that while we give so much oxygen and so much verbiage to talking about the experiences in African American in the criminal justice system as the one of the defendant, that we don't talk about the experience of the African American as a victim of crime. Because the truth is that we are disproportionately victims of crime as well. And somebody needs to be speaking to that experience also. And one of the most powerful experiences that I've had since I've been a prosecutor was when I was a rape prosecutor, and understanding that the personhood of an African American woman is often devalued, both by law enforcement and also by juries, quite frankly. And somebody needed to give voice to that. And so knowing why you were there and what you are meant to do and what you're meant to give voice to is what sustains you in this work, what sustains me in this work. I don't come to that with tension. My hope is that I can bring that to light for every single colleague that I have and every single unit of this community that I engage with. And so I think that when I go out and I'm trying to recruit and bring in make more African American prosecutors and more prosecutors of color, I'm trying to give voice to that in a way that it hasn't been done before. We can't miss this opportunity to broaden the voice of this community and who's speaking it.
A criminal justice system is only as good as the obviously imperfect individuals who are honored to administer it. And it needs to be not only fair, but there needs to be an appearance of fairness. And part of that is having a diversity of backgrounds in people who are tasked with administering it. President Obama, who gave me the honor of appointing me to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, recognized that. He did a wonderful job of diversifying the federal bench. And it's important that when people come before the system, that they see people who look like them, not just for the sake of that, but because of the perception and actuality that brings to people, the confidence and ability to respect the decisions, even if they disagree with it. So I am proud to be a member of that imperfect system. And we just need to continue to do the work that we can to make it a more perfect system for everybody involved. And that work continues each and every day.
Mr. Ferguson, we're going to give